Mahatma Gandhi was an Indian lawyer who became the primary leader of India's independence movement. He not only led India to independence from British rule, but also inspired movements for civil rights and freedom across the world in several other countries.
Early life. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born on October 2, 1869 at Porbandar in the present-day Indian state of Gujarat. His father was a chief minister of Porbandar, and his mother was a deeply religious woman who fasted regularly. Young Gandhi was a shy, unremarkable student who was so timid that he slept with the lights on even as a teenager. In the ensuing years, the teenager rebelled by smoking, eating meat, and stealing change from the household servants. At the age of 19, Mohandas left home to study law in London at the Inner Temple. During Gandhi's first stay in London, from 1888 to 1891, he became more committed to the meatless diet, joining the executive committee of London Vegetarian Society, and started to read a variety of sacred texts to learn more about the world religions. Upon returning to India in 1891, Gandhi learned that his mother had died just weeks earlier. He struggled to gain his footing as a lawyer. In his first courtroom case, a nervous Gandhi blanked when the time came to cross-examine the witness. He immediately fled the courtroom after reimbursing his client for its legal fees. He soon accepted a position with an Indian firm that sent him to its office in South Africa. Along with his wife, Kasturbai, and their children, Gandhi remained in South Africa for nearly 20 years. The birth of passive resistance. Gandhi was appalled by the discrimination he experienced as an Indian immigrant in South Africa. When a European magistrate in Durban asked him to take off his turban, he refused and left the courtroom. On a train voyage to Pretoria, he was thrown out first-class railway compartment and beaten up by the white stagecoach driver after refusing to give up his seat for a European passenger. In 1906, Gandhi organized his first mass civil disobedience campaign, which he called Satyagraha, Truth and Fairness, in reaction to the South African Transvaal government's new restrictions on the rights of Indians, including the refusal to recognize Hindu marriages. Under pressure, the South African government accepted the compromise negotiated by Gandhi and General Jan Christian Smuts that included recognition of Hindu marriages and the abolition of the pawn tax for Indians. In July 1914, Gandhi left South Africa to return to India. In 1919, Gandhi launched an organized campaign of passive resistance in response to Parliament's passage of the Rowlatt Acts, which gave colonial authorities emergency power to suppress subversive activities. He backed up after violence broke out, but only temporarily, and by 1920, he was the most visible figure in the movement for Indian independence. Leader of movement. As part of his non-violent, non-cooperation campaign for home rule, Gandhi stressed the importance of economic independence for India. He particularly advocated the manufacture of khadar, or homespun cloth, in order to replace imported textiles from Britain. Invested with all the authority of Indian National Congress, Gandhi turned the independence movement into the massive organization, leading boycotts of British manufacturers and institutions representing British influence in India, including legislators and schools. After sporadic violence broke out, Gandhi announced the end of the resistance movement to the dismay of his followers. British authorities arrested Gandhi in March 1922 and tried him for sedition. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but when released in 1924 after undergoing an operation for appendicitis, he refrained from active participation in politics for the next several years, but in 1930 launched a new civil disobedience campaign against the colonial government's tax on salt, which greatly affected India's poorest citizens. A divided movement. In 1931, after British authorities made some concessions, Gandhi again called up the resistance movement and agreed to represent the Congress Party at the Round Table Conference in London. Meanwhile, some of his party colleagues, particularly Mohammed Ali Jinnah, a leading voice for India's Muslim minority, grew frustrated with Gandhi's methods and what they saw as a lack of concrete gains. Arrested upon his return by a newly aggressive colonial government, Gandhi began a series of hunger strikes in protest of the treatment of Indian so-called untouchables, the poorer classes, whom he renamed Harijans or Children of God. In 1934, Gandhi announced his retirement from politics in order to concentrate his efforts on working within rural communities. Drawn back into the political fray by the outbreak of World War II, Gandhi again took control of the INC, demanding a British withdrawal from India in return for Indian cooperation with the war effort. Partition and death of Gandhi. After the Labour Party took power in Britain in 1947, negotiations over India Home Rule began between the British, the Congress Party, and the Muslim League, now led by Jinnah. Later that year, Britain granted India its independence but split the country into two dominions, India and Pakistan. Amid the massive riots that followed partition, Gandhi urged Hindus and Muslims to live peacefully together and undertook the hunger strike until riots in Calcutta ceased. In January 1948, Gandhi carried out yet another fast, this time to bring about peace to the city of Delhi. On January 30, 12 days after the fast ended, Gandhi was on his way to an evening prayer meeting in Delhi when he was shot to death by Nathram Ghats, a Hindu fanatic outraged by Mahatma's efforts to negotiate with Jinnah and other Muslims. The next day, roughly 1 million people followed the procession as Gandhi's body was carried in state through the streets of city and cremated on banks of the holy Juna River.